welcome to the February 26, 2024 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials webpage. And with that, thank you again for joining us. And I call this work session to order, and we'll turn it right over to the city manager to introduce.
Thank you, Mayor. Our first topic is all about fire governance. We've been deep in this conversation for a while, maybe too many whiles, but excited to be here today with an update, and I'll turn it over to Chief Caven to introduce the topic.
Mayor, Council, thank you for the opportunity to bring this important subject before you. Tonight, we're going to hear from our consultants with AP Triton, who was hired in the fall of 2023 to continue our governance process with a little more depth and subject matter expertise to add to the conversations that have been going on since 2021 is when we had our more formal status update to the council just about Eugene Springfield Fire, our governance, and where we needed to go. It was spring of 2022 that we really engaged in a governance review panel process, and we moved through 2022 with some hiccups along the way. Dan and his team are going to walk you through those details. Tonight, the run of show is really to get a good baseline of the current conditions in ESF. How did we get here? How is it working? What are the challenges to prepare you all for a work session in May to receive the full and final report with recommendations. The team from AP Triton has a tremendous amount of expertise in the field. I'll introduce you to Dan Peterson, our lead consultant, who came up through the ranks in Medford, so has a familiarity with city government. He took over and ran a fire district in Southern Oregon for several years before moving on to a fire authority in Utah in a metro-sized fire organization. And so the depth of experience that Dan and his team bring and the familiarity really with the establishment of Eugene Springfield Fire has really added a lot to this process. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Dan Peterson, who we appreciate is taking his time away from his vacation in Costa Rica to present to us. So thank you for that, Dan.
Sure thing. We're happy to be here, and I'll start the slide in a minute. But on the call with us, we've got David Honey and Don Jarvis. Another member of our team, Stacy Maxwell, is not on the call, but she's also working with David in making this work. So maybe David, you do a brief introduction of yourself, and Don of you.
Sure. Good evening, counselors. I'm Dave Honey. I'm a senior associate with AP Triton. I work on financial components of studies like this.
Oh, sorry. I am Don Jarvis, also a senior consultant with AP Triton. I'm mostly working with the facilities and fleet, along with the organizational part of this study.
Wonderful. So we're going to walk through a slide presentation, and I think I understand you might have a copy of it, which will help as we go through. So I'm going to share my screen. And then walk through presentation. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we are here basically to address an update on the progress and timelines, and to bring you a presentation of the findings directly related to the current conditions. We're not ready to talk and present recommendations yet. We've spent a lot of time making sure that we have a solid understanding of what's going on today before we launch into the future. It's important that we spend time understanding what's working, what's not working, before we try and solve any of the issues. As we go along, if you have specific questions to the slide, I may need some assistance in having the ability to answer your question. But at the end, we'll give time to discuss the information on a broader level after the presentation. A little bit of the background, the purpose of this study is to really look on whether or not it's feasible to continue operating as you are today, to establish an intergovernmental agreement to allow one city to provide service to the other, to establish an intergovernmental agreement to form an IGE, to form an independent fire district, or if none of those are feasible, what it would look like to dissolve the existing agreement and return to individual city fire agencies. The timelines, we kicked off this project on August 9th. We met with ESF staff. On the 29th, we met with the governance review panel. And by October 9th, ESF had completed the majority of the data uploads that we needed to get really started. The week of October 30th, we were on site. We met with about 50 different people through the stakeholder meetings, from elected officials to city staff from both cities to ESF staff to the neighboring districts, even with a few neighboring agencies that are close on the border with ESF. On December 7th, the first draft was presented to the ESF for technical review. Then on December 27th, a draft was presented with current findings to the cities of Eugene and Springfield to spend time with their support services to make sure that they had a chance to validate the data that we were capturing. By February 9th, we had completed the majority of the technical review of the draft. We had a few more small things that we completed after that, but that's why we're here today, is to get a chance to present to you what's really happening today from what we discovered in our findings. Our next steps in the things we're doing right now is our update. So we provided one on February 22nd to the governance review panel. We're here tonight with Eugene's, and on March 4th, we're scheduled with Springfield. Late March, early April, we should have a first draft of the full report available for review by ESF and the city managers. After a little bit of back and forth with that, we hope to have a final draft of the report late April, early May, available for presentation to the governance review panel and both city councils. The background: 2007, you formed a 3rd Battalion system. 2010, you evolved that into functional consolidations. Fire departments branded as ESF. Apparatus, stations, uniforms, branding reflected the new name. Eugene and Springfield remained independent entities and operate with separate fire and EMS budgets. The duplicated admin and support positions were eliminated in those first short period of time. Employees working with ESF are designated as either Eugene or Springfield, not both. And operational employees are assigned to stations regardless of their employer. The service area is up here, and I know you're all real familiar with it, but it helps sometimes just to get a glance at where Battalion 1, 2, and 3 are. The population served. The ESF serves a total of 258,000. This slide represents the fire districts and the water districts inside of each city and how they balance to the total population served by Eugene Springfield Fire. Service delivery, there's 16 stations between the two. Springfield's operational staffing is from 5 stations and shows what's on the screen. Operational staffing from Eugene is 11 stations, and that shows what's on the screen. The financial summaries, I'll turn over to David. He'll work through the next 3 slides.
And good evening again, counselors. We have been working closely with ESF administration to get a good picture of revenue and expenditures for Eugene Fire and EMS, as well as Springfield Fire and EMS separately, and then also looking at ESF as a whole. And we're presenting actual revenue and expenditures from fiscal year 19 through fiscal year 2023. On this first financial slide, you can see it's an ESF financial summary, and we had revenue of $23.6 million in fiscal year 19, increasing to $29.1 million in fiscal year 23. That's about a 23% increase. We see that Eugene generated 69% of total fiscal year 2023 revenue, with a balance being generated by Springfield. A few of the top revenue sources in 2023 that I wanted to identify are emergency medical services fees. These are about $14.3 million in the last completed fiscal year. 67% of that generated by Eugene and the balance of 33% by Springfield. Next, we have ground emergency medical transportation, or GEMT, revenues of about $5.7 million. And we have reimbursement for fire services. These are things like mutual aid or services to fire and water districts within the borders of their respective cities. And then we have about $700,000 in grant revenue. In fiscal year 2023, expenditures were $84.4 million. That was about a 21% increase over 5 years prior, of $70 million in fiscal year 19. Eugene in 2023 incurred 72% of all fire and EMS related expenditures, with Springfield incurring the balance of 28%. Major areas of expenditure in 2023 were personnel. Personnel accounted for about 71% of all ESF expenditures, and those were just under $60.5 million in fiscal year 23. The bulk of that, 74%, being spent by Eugene, with 26% by Springfield. Materials, supplies, and contractual costs were a major item as well, about $7.8 million in fiscal year 23. Interdepartmental fleet costs of about $3.6 million, and vehicle and equipment costs of just about $1.1 million. Looking at Eugene Fire specifically on the next slide, over the past 5 fiscal years, from fiscal year 19 to 23, Eugene Fire and EMS revenues increased from $15.7 million to just under $20 million. Significant increases in GEMT revenues contributed to this overall increase. The GEMT program, Eugene started receiving revenue for that in fiscal year 20. That's increased to nearly $4 million annually, looking at fiscal year 23 revenues. Additionally, revenue from EMS fees have increased from $9.1 million to $9.6 million in fiscal year 23. On the expenditure side, during the same 5-year period, expenditures increased about 23%, from $49.3 million to $60.6 million. And significant areas of increase on the Eugene side include personnel costs. Personnel costs account for about 74% of Eugene's overall fire and EMS expenditures. And there were increases in the materials, supplies, and contractual costs as well. The third and final slide for finances focuses on Springfield and their financial summary. Since 2019, Springfield Fire and EMS revenues have increased about 16%, going from $7.9 million to $9.2 million. And like Eugene, GEMT revenue increases account for much of this difference. On the expenditure side for Springfield Fire during the same period, and we see expenditure increases of about 15%. Materials, supplies, and contractual costs increased by about $1.7 million, or 95%. And most of this increase is attributed to increased payments from Springfield to Eugene for fire and EMS services. And finally, overall fiscal year 2023 expenditures were just under $24 million at $23.8 million, compared with $20.7 million 5 years ago. And personnel costs accounted for approximately 2/3 of all Springfield Fire FY23 expenses. And that concludes the financial slide section of the report.
A part that we spent a significant amount of time in is related to the administration and support positions in a shared balance between 2010 and 2023. So we've reconstructed the staffing levels for 2010 as accurately as we possibly could. We reviewed budget documents, organizational charts that were captured in the original 2009 ESCI study on functional consolidation, a review with the current chief, ESF Finance Administration Manager, Springfield's Finance Director, and even retired Chief Randy Groves to help get this accurate. A key part of this discussion related to 12 positions that were originally in Springfield's billing office that have been eliminated over the last several years due to a reduced external ambulance billing clients. So there's no longer 12 positions showing in the data for 2010 or in today. We've instead taken the 4 remaining billing EMS specialist positions and assigned 3 in Eugene and 1 in Springfield for both 2010 and 2023 to help balance that. So with that in mind and bringing it to basically what we believe is the most accurate reconstruction, in 2010, Eugene employed 41.25 admin and support positions, which together with Springfield and Eugene was 68.01 of the combined department's cost of admin and support positions. Today, Eugene employs 39 admin and support positions, and it's 74.23% of the ESF admin and support position costs. Springfield in 2010 employed 18, which was 31.99% of the combined cost. Today, Springfield employs 14, which is 25.77 of the combined cost. In the city of Eugene, there's 5.25 positions that were funded in 2010 that are not funded today, and 3 new positions that were not funded in 2010 for a net reduction of 2.25 positions. The positions not funded today compared to 2010 are Deputy Chief, Finance Manager, Battalion Chief Training, Battalion Chief Fire Marshal, 0.75 Deputy Fire Marshal, 0.5 Program Support. The 3 new positions funded, EMS CQI, EMS Fire Instructor, and an Application Systems Analyst. In the city of Springfield, there are 6 positions funded in 2010 that are not funded today, and 2 new positions. Positions not funded today, Fire Chief, Deputy Chief, 2 DFMs, an Executive Assistant, and a Program Support position. 2 positions funded that were not funded in 2010 are Fire Maintenance Worker and Application Support Technician. Now, what this means for us is the reduced cost from the merger, total 11.25 admin and support positions that were eliminated in the combined organization since 2010, which tells us that the reduced cost of this merger is $2.5 million at today's wages and benefits each year. In Eugene, the 5.25 positions that were eliminated is a reduced cost of just under 1.2 million of wages and benefits this year, but every year that reduced cost is experienced. In Springfield, Springfield eliminated 6 and has a reduced cost of 1.3 million at 2023 wages and benefits each year. The net reduction of cost, this is where we take the total positions eliminated and then add back in the new ones since 2010, makes a reduced cost of 1.6 million at today's wages. Eugene reduced cost is 527,000. Springfield's reduced cost is 1.1 million. The balance of cost reduction, and we spent a lot of time looking at the IGA. The 2017, the most recent IGA, does not identify a balance, a defined balance of funding from each city for these positions. The target is maintaining each city's service level while benefiting from the shared administrative positions. As a vacancy occurs, the city managers and the fire chief meet and discuss who's going to fill that position. Over the years, that's what's created this evolution of staffing related to the administrative and support positions. So the percentage of cost has changed. 2010, it was 68 to 31. Today, it's 74 to 25. If you applied the 2010 percentage to 2023, Eugene's personnel expenditures would be 600,000 less each year, and Springfield's would be 600,000 more.
Oh.
I think it's important to note, though, and I have this at the bottom of the slide, that this is an arbitrary point in time, and we're looking at recommendations that share this cost in the strategic analysis of options that will be more directly related to the demand for administrative and support services as opposed to an arbitrary point in time. But we felt it was important to capture what we felt was probably a goal or an intent of the IGA and give you what those numbers looked like. Administrative and support functions themselves, ESF leadership, the fire chief is the department head, like you know. He is a part of the ESF leadership and administrative team, tasked with typical city level department functions. And the team works with 2 different city support services administrative systems daily. In the city systems, each city provides the typical support services independently, such as finance, HR, IT, fleet, and facility maintenance. And working with ESF is unique for most city department services as well. So when they work with another department in the city, they are working strictly with either a Springfield or a Eugene support service. When it comes to ESF, they need to think about the other cities' involvement in that particular piece. They work out some systems. They've done their effort to improve the workflow of administrative functions, but there's really complications in all support areas that persist due to the distinct governance and administrative structures at the city level. And there's considerable process differences unique to each city, depending on the employee, the apparatus, the facility, or a specific issue that might require city support function involvement. The advantages today, and these were very clear to us as we started looking at them, there's an incredibly effective and efficient operational deployment as a single agency. The entire fire department operationally operates as a single unit, moving back and forth between the city based on the need. Emergency response and surge capacity is much greater since the functional merger, and there's a broader scope and resource availability that provides greater service to the community than could be accomplished by either city on their own. The reduced duplication of administrative position also provides economies of scale and savings in administration and support staffing each year. Again, the reduced cost is $2.5 million each year at today's wages and benefits. The key challenges, there's a number of these that we've identified, and some are more involved than others. The entire first part of this report is around 100 pages. So there's a lot of detail in here. We're pulling out what we feel are the most important things for you to be aware of today without overwhelming you with the detail of the report. We picked out 8 key challenges that we want to talk about. Governance and administration, the management of and accountability to 2 different city managers and councils, and participating in leadership teams across both cities requires some real balance and coordination to meet the expectation. The fire chief is attending meetings in both cities and accountable to 2 systems. The fire chief himself has a pretty good picture of ESF as a whole, but neither city really understands what the priorities are for the other city, which makes it requires the chief to help balance that between the 2 cities based on their overarching city priorities. There's a feeling of the fire department is outsourced. Some Springfield officials feel like their fire department's been outsourced to Eugene. Basically, they feel like it's Eugene Fire, and they don't feel like they have adequate representation. That's not all of them. It's just a few feel that way in Springfield. In the budget process, Eugene Springfield Fire has to develop 2 completely separate budgets within each division for the different processes and under 2 different city governments. So with each division building that, they want to follow the guidance for each city and create those 2 divisions. But each of the staff can have a bit of a hard time prioritizing their work inside of the city's priorities when each city has unique priorities that could apply to what the fire department is trying to work on. And then the fire department and the fire chief and his staff presents the budget twice to separate governing bodies, using a different process. In human relations, the fire department is working through different HR policies and practices between the two cities as they work in an evolving and challenging work environment. As an example, if there's discipline involving an employee, ESF needs to follow the procedure outlined for the city that actually employs them. In Springfield, that could involve a delay to allow for access to pre-loss legal, which is external, whereas in Eugene, that process is in-house. If this issue involves two people, which it often will, a supervisor and an employee, it may be two separate city employees, which might require the inclusion of both HR staff and legal from both cities to work through an individual issue. Health benefits. The two cities offer different health plans. Eugene provides a low deductible and Springfield offers a high deductible with access to a free clinic. They're equivalent, but not necessarily equal. The challenge for the firefighters is, I think if they could choose between the two, it would be very productive for them because it depends on your stage of life on which one might be better, but they don't get to choose. It really is decided on when they're hired, whether they're a Eugene or a Springfield station or Springfield employee. And this creates a little bit of noise in the station between employees and even their families about the insurance they have because the person working with them in the station has a different plan. In the payroll tax system, Eugene and Springfield firefighters assigned to Eugene stations are subject to the city payroll tax, whereas personnel assigned to Springfield stations are not. And I think it was really clear to us that the employees really understand the purpose of the tax and appreciate the value it brings by helping to fund the fire department. The problem points that hit is that a firefighter is assigned to Springfield for the day does not pay the payroll tax. However, if they come into Eugene for a 4-hour training session, they're going to be assessed the tax for those 4 hours that they're done. And someone is having to track them down to ask for sure if that crew was in Eugene that day and then assess that payroll tax to them. And firefighters assigned to Springfield for maybe most of their career, but if they spend their last year in Eugene Fire, their entire retirement payouts are going to be subject to the payroll tax. It's noise in the stations, that irritation that comes and that realization that they're not a singular fire department. In network configuration, the different network configurations across Eugene and Springfield create some challenges with them accessing the resources, especially if they're not working inside the city that they normally work or that they're employed with. They have workarounds. They have a way to log into their computer and the MDC, but they're not able to log into the opposite city's system. And there's a few inequities in what's available to each employee in the systems. So resources that could be available to a Eugene employee are not available, may not be available to a Springfield employee if Springfield doesn't offer the same opportunity, which can also create differences between crews working in the same station. In our next portion, the part that we're in process with now, that we've got a good picture of where we're at, is this portion looks at the strategic portions of these 5 categories that we've already identified. And we are finding some good sustainable options that should alleviate many of the challenges that we've been able to identify. And we'll have more information as we finish the analysis. We need to make sure that we're thorough on all the minutia before we bring it to you, options that we are going to recommend for you to consider. And the recommendations, we will have some recommendation for you to provide sustainable fire and EMS service delivery in both cities, along with their financial impact and some implementation considerations. In closing on this, the Eugene, Springfield, and ESF staff have been fully engaged as we conducted this analysis. Everybody has engaged. Everybody is looking for a solution. We asked for a lot of data, and all of the departments, city and fire department staff, were amazing in helping us get what we needed. The level and depth of service that's provided to both cities today by ESF is exceptional. And there's been a lot of work to address these challenges, not just from ESF, but from both cities' support services. There are just some persistent issues that can't seem to be solved. One of the best explanation that I heard on this is that if we keep trying to work in the current model, there's a feeling that we're just nibbling on the edges of these persistent issues. We're not really solving many of these daily issues that not only the firefighters are facing, but the administration is facing and the city support services are facing. But as we progress through this analysis, like we mentioned, we're finding some good options. With that, I'm going to stop the sharing and see if there's any question.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fascinating and both encouraging and a little overwhelming, I would say. Some of the complexity of those challenges, I'm glad you're equal to the task, because those sound, really difficult to resolve. So I'm really the next step. So are there counselors with questions or comments on this report? Counselor Keating, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Apologies for physically being tardy, but I was monitoring telephonically on the way back from Salem. You mentioned, and thank you, by the way, and you mentioned the noise in the stations and the challenges and the disparities between benefits. What are the pros and cons broadly of establishing a Eugene Springfield Fire District?
Well, the pros are that you've got an increased depth of service. Your 16 fire stations that you're able to serve are doing a great job of being able to move back and forth between the cities. Your pros are that you're effectively reducing your cost by $2.5 million a year by not duplicating service that's not necessary. The cons are, the challenges are working through the independent cities processes by having the two agencies be separate, complete entities merged together at really the administration of the fire department level only.
Okay. All right, thank you. Alan.
Yeah, thanks. Good summary of the report. I point out that under governance, administration, and budget process, the MWMC actually does 3 different entities and 3 budgets with Lane County, Springfield, and Eugene. So it goes with jurisdictional entities. On the health benefits, so I understand the different packages, but each city has its own package of health benefits, right? So if you're a Eugene firefighter, you get that package. If you're a Springfield firefighter, you get that package. And thus that's the rub, because they're not the same.
Correct.
And I didn't quite get network configuration. Can you explain that one again?
So the challenges, I can grab it for you. So the challenges are with network security and the 2 different cities, the way that they're set up, that there has to be workarounds established to access the network, to access certain emergency, charting equipment, mapping equipment, all of that we use with dispatch. There are workarounds built into the system. The problem really comes from if you don't move back and forth between the cities on a daily basis, your familiarity on how to do that is perishable. And a lot of times, especially with some of our more senior positions, our captains, our battalion chiefs that don't do it as much, they don't have access to that critical information. There are workarounds throughout the systems. They're clunky. And quite frankly, through this process, we're meeting with both cities' IT groups, and I think there are some recognitions on workarounds that were built years ago that caused great concern for, in particular, our IT staff here in Eugene with the network issues or security concerns that we have, that those workarounds are vulnerabilities in our systems.
So it's an IT legacy issue, mostly.
Yeah.
that we've managed to stitch together. Okay, that's all I have right now.
Okay, thank you. Other counselors with questions or comments? Lindsay and then Emily.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit more about how we got to that kind of discrepancy in the proportion of employees so that budget is higher in Eugene versus Springfield? I know it's arbitrary point in time, but I'd like to dive into that a little bit more.
Dan, do you guys want to tackle that, or you want me to?
I can tackle that. I can, I think the bottom line is the fact that the original IGA and even the current IGA didn't identify a percentage. It didn't really identify a specific goal. Instead, it identified an opportunity to discuss each vacancy based on the ability or the need for replacement, and then which city would replace the position, hire the position. When a new position comes up that's necessary, it's a discussion between the two city managers and the fire chief. And I think really it's been an evolution of different fire chiefs, different city managers, and not having a target to shoot for in the IGA has allowed it to just evolve a little bit. I don't think there's anything more than an evolution of those positions.
I would add just one piece of context to that. When we go back to when this was established in 2010, when the IGA was formally executed, shortly thereafter, local government started to feel the pinch of the recession that began in 2008 and 2009. And so what positions were lost as a part of redundancy? The vision was for that to be leveraging that capacity into other programs, other things that the fire department needed, quickly pivoted towards what can we do to sustain street level service capacity. And so a lot of those things went away, programs went away, and both cities got support positions. And I think the one thing that, for clarity, when we talk about these administration and support positions, really that includes everybody who doesn't ride on an emergency response apparatus on 24-hour shifts. So deputy fire marshals, training staff, administrative staff, chief officers, those types of things. Where that discrepancy really, I think, started to grow was the rate at which each city was able to add things back into the system through different mechanisms. Some of what we gained in Eugene were things that are funded by the CSI. New innovative concepts, ideas, the alternative response things, all of these kind of growth in different areas allowed that discrepancy or to kind of expand a little bit. So it's no one specific item that caused that to happen, but a perfect storm of a lot of things over the last decade.
Excellent, thank you. Do you see in the future wanting to have a target so that it's not quite such a...
I think Dan and his team are working through that in their strategic analysis, and I'll let him kind of follow up on that. But a lot of what I've heard is they're testing out and looking at how do you measure this, taking input from elected officials in both cities, and then just looking at the facts and going, this could make sense in the way that we split this up and fund from operational to administrative and support components. So I'd expect that out of them in May for sure.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that is an area that we will give you something to consider in a formula that we think will be, like I mentioned, more accurate in identifying the burden of administrative and support based on the operational demand.
Mentioning CSI, you mentioned, Dan, that the retirement disbursements would be taxed even if your entire time was with Springfield and now you've moved into Eugene. And so is there a way we can account for that? Or can we talk about that a little bit more? Or...
Not really. I think that your payroll tax is built for all employees based on where they're working, whether they're a city employee or someone else in the city. And I don't think it's possible for finance to look at those nuances of retirement without potentially violating the taxing laws that are required for the payroll tax you've adopted.
Thank you for the presentation and for the information. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Emily?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm glad you printed out all the slides because there's so much in there, a lot of dollar amounts. Jennifer and I were on the review, the survey, and it was really fascinating. And I feel like it gave me a head start on this because we talked about a lot of what's in here, at least generally. With all those questions, I found that I kept coming back to what do the firefighters want? I think that saving money is really key, especially right now. I hate to see duplication of efforts also. But my biggest concern is that noise. I think fire is such an important part of our city that I want the personnel to feel like they are equal and not be grumbling. I'm a good grumbler. I wouldn't like it at all. So safety is really important, but I'm glad you guys are going to figure out the best path because I always want people to be happy, but especially the people protecting us. So thank you for this work. I'm really looking forward to the recommendations.
Okay, thank you. I know Alan wants a second round. Do you want to go, Randy?
Sure.
Go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief Caven. Thank you, staffs in both cities. I know this has not been an easy process. And a big thank you to Chief Peterson, Don, David, and AP Triton for all the work you have done on this. You have done a remarkable job of piecing together a really complicated and somewhat fractured story. I can shed a little bit of light on kind of how we got to where we were. I don't know the changes that happened after I retired in 2016, but to begin with, we kind of modeled this after the MWMC service. We were thinking that might be a model that we could go with. Back in the early days, when then Springfield Chief Murphy and I were having these discussions. And the genesis of the whole 3-battalion system began with what we used to call hard boundaries that we had between the two cities, where depending which side of the line you fell on, you might get really fast response or you might get a much longer response. And it just didn't seem like that was in the best interest and welfare of either community for both the people and the properties that we protect. And so that's where we came up with the 3-battalion concept of trying to operate the 3 battalions as one, but we still ran into a lot of problems because the training was different, the equipment was different. Springfield even had different size connections on their fire hydrants than Eugene did. So it was just a lot of challenges that we ran into. Good people on both sides of the freeway. Just the best way I can equate it, it's kind of like playing a football game and halfway through the first quarter, another team shows up to help you, but they're playing under different plays, under different coaches, and you're running into each other. And so this whole process started out as better, more effective service delivery rather than cost savings and efficiencies. But as the Great Recession came into play, all of a sudden the cost savings became king. And that's what we were encouraged to work on by both cities. And we took that on with to the best of our ability. As far as the 1/3, 2/3 split, that's kind of the way the cost sharing started out. But we didn't have a set written target because we knew that all positions that came up for review would go through the 2 city managers and the fire chief at the time. And so we had really big things we were trying to work on. We had 4 unions, we had 2 cities, we had 7 contract districts that we served. We had separate contracts that we're trying to merge into one. We had separate procedures that we're trying to meld into one, separate policies, equipment specs, on and on and on. So it was kind of knitting this 2 together. And in fact, Alan, we talked quite a bit with Susie when we were pulling this together, and I'm out of time, so maybe I'll
sorry.
second
Yeah,
round
sorry.
later.
Listening to you talk and I'm not looking at the time.
Well, I
Thank you.
kind of follow the rules. I got a lot I could say, but
Okay, well, I'll give you a second round, but Alan, do you want to
Sure.
go for it
And
for your
Susie
second
was
round?
the MWNC general manager, which is
Right.
why you talked to her. I had 3 questions. One relates to the financial summary. and I'm trying to get a handle on how this works. So population is kind of the way I was thinking about how this would be distributed, 73-27 roughly. And that's pretty close to what we got in on the revenues expenditures, but not exactly. 67-31 on the revenues and 72-28 on expenditures. So it's kind of in the ballpark. And I don't think we're trying to get to exactly the right 72.8% for Eugene, but how does that actually work operationally? Is part A. And part B is like some of these are really different, like vehicles and equipment, 40-60s, 80-20 on interdepartmental fee costs. How does that all play out in the way you do the calculus to try to make it equitable from a cost perspective?
Yeah, I think on the day-to-day, when we consider our operations, those are pretty much unchanged. I mean, neither city has added response resources since we went down this spot. And so where that really starts to separate out a little bit, and it's, I think, difficult, and Dan's team can probably concur, when you look at an operational cost or those FTE, but then you see Springfield's contractual services or materials and services doubling in the last 5 years. Well, in 2023 in particular, Eugene was carrying up to 16 extra firefighter FTE that were billed back to Springfield. And it's just by the way that people are hired and promoted that we reconcile that. And so a lot of that nuance gets buried in those numbers to make it work year over year. That's one of the challenges to the discussion about budgets and budgeting. Whereas to the MWMC, comments, they create a budget for MWMC, present it to 3 different governing bodies. Ours are different. In fact, we're in a biennial budget now. Fire staff still have to reconcile the Eugene budget in the middle of it to determine how much needs to be leveraged back and forth between Springfield or Eugene, whether it's overtime or there's a number of positions that one city employs that are serving in budgeted positions in the other. And all that gets reconciled in those numbers. So it happens, but it's an incredible administrative burden, which isn't really recognized in those 2010 numbers of staff that we're serving ESF. When you get down into the vehicles and equipment, it can be broken down by just how we do our work. Springfield contracts for their apparatus maintenance through Hughes Fire Equipment, which is a private fire apparatus dealer who we buy our things from. Whereas in Eugene, we have fleet rates that are baked into our internal service funds to accommodate for that. And you would much more directly see a vehicle purchase come out on Eugene's or in Springfield's budget, where ours are built into that internal service fund over at Fleet, right? And so that's where it's like, wow, that doesn't fit into the 1/3, 2/3. Well, it's different ways that business is done for those components.
Yeah, any particular year would look different.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so,
Dan, did I miss anything on that answer that you guys wanted to add?
No, I think you hit that really well. And I think what another councilman mentioned was a specific year where maybe somebody purchased some additional apparatus can dramatically change a number swing that year, but the previous year could be very different.
Yeah. We just ordered $5 million worth of fire trucks in Springfield a couple months ago. That would way throw, those numbers off.
So how does all that work when we're talking about building a new fire station in Eugene, say around New City Hall? How's that going to play into all this equation? Because we're roughly trying to make sure nobody's subsidizing the other, right? So, but we're going to add a whole fire station.
Correct. When you look at the overall call volume, and I think Dan mentioned early on in this report, they didn't need to dive for them deep into operations because it's been set. It hasn't really changed. When you look at call volume and where we're talking about building a fire station within Eugene, we're talking about an area that within, I think since 2016, I don't have my charts in front of me for call volumes, but basically within a narrow time frame, we saw call volume in Springfield go up by 20% and call volume in the city of Eugene go up 44%. The problem that we're trying to solve with this station near City Hall is a downtown core response reliability, and then all the neighboring fire stations that are serving it. Where the conversation does get more complicated in this environment, or which I think we'll see in the strategic analysis, is what about those border territories? The reality is, since the merger started, we did a brief analysis with AP Triton to see, is one station over supplementing one city or not? And really, they're moving back and forth somewhat seamlessly. But I think a great example to put it in perspective, when we think about the growth of high density multifamily housing east of Autzen Stadium, but within the city limits of Eugene, all of that work has fallen on a Springfield fire station. And so there are things, but it gets swapped by Engine 13 coming out of the university and serving Glenwood, which is now a Springfield territory. And so numbers do fold, but the question becomes, as the Glenwood area redevelops and as the university area continues to build up and up, what becomes of that border territory, and how exactly do we fund a fire station that will serve either city 50%? Those are yet to be answered, and those are going to be important questions to be answered in the strategic analysis of how is this set up? How do the cities pay for additional things? And as Dan alluded to, there's some scenarios where you would pick the right number of the investment, and you would pay 70-30 or whatever that might be for a border station or for other infill. There are other models that they're evaluating that if that unit serves just one jurisdiction in particular, then it's the responsibility of that jurisdiction to fund it. And so the real questions become in those border territories. It's the same one for us as we think about our external territories where we're growing into the North Delta. Do we add a station out there? Do we move some things around? We're going to have some technology to help us answer those questions that will help inform both of our cities going forward, but it impacts everybody around us, not just the metro area.
The last question's about, maybe for the consultants, I assume you've done this analysis before, but you've got these 5 options that you're looking at, and you're going to compare them. And what's the evaluation criteria that you're going to be using, and the weighting you're going to put on those evaluation criteria? Criteria like, what are they? Lower cost, better service, the challenges that you list, which create some of the noise and the equity issues. What are the things you're going to be looking at and doing this comparison evaluation, and how are you going to weight them?
Well, I think it's going to be a little more subjective for us than being able to weight them. We're looking for a solution that maintains the high quality of service you're getting, doesn't cost much more, alleviates the noise, and takes care of the problems. We're looking for the ones that do the best work for you as a council. We need you to be able to decide some of the components of what's the most important portion of it, but we'll bring you the models that we think do the best at meeting that target, and we'll identify the pros and cons in each model, and then have that discussion about what we feel might be the most important. But in the end, it's you need to decide fully what's most important to you based on what we bring you. We'll recommend some, but you'll want to look at those pros and cons. To build a little on what the chief had talked about too, you're not the only fire agency out there that has worked through these shared services and trying to maintain some ownership and responsibility as a city versus go to a fire district. Like a fire district is one option, but the other option, for example, where he talked about my work with an authority in Salt Lake, we had 15 municipalities that worked together and had a lot of shared services back and forth where cities first 2 stations cross boundaries. That particular component became really important to find a good financial model, a good operational model, so that the crews could go out and do their job every day, and that each city felt like they were paying their fair share, not too much, not too little. And we found a good path in that way for those governing bodies. And that board of directors was 17 different mayors that all found a good path. we're looking and comparing some of those along with communities like Livermore, Pleasanton, Orange County Fire Authority, and what they're doing that's working to bring to you what we think with your challenges will work best for Eugene and Springfield.
I guess you brought up the fire district. That's the one that's different. That's the one that doesn't look like the other ones. The other ones still maintain the authority and the control by the city councils. The fire district eliminates that and puts it into a third party entity. So how does that get evaluated?
We'll let you know what the feasibility of that option is. And we'll talk about what that works like. If it's feasible, then it would be more of a decision on whether any of you want to go there or not.
Well, what would make it not feasible?
The tax compression, probably more than anything on our end.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Randy?
Thank you, Mayor. Also, I just want to say thank you to Chief Caven. I know that's not an easy job to do, going back and forth and trying to keep all the plates spinning at once. But I think you've been doing a tremendous job at that, and you're still innovating. One of the things I wanted to add, and I think it's been talked about a little bit, but I want to bright light it. Some of the differences between the two cities. Eugene is just a more complicated community. I mean, we've got a much larger unhoused population that's driving a lot of our street level calls. And Eugene Springfield Fire has tried to adapt in the city of Eugene some of the response models, which also accounts for some of the cost differentials, because it does cost more to branch out and start to try to develop these other services. And whenever you're trying to do something new, including this merger, you start out with a vision and you start out with really high ideals, but you quickly learn that there's a lot of roadblocks in the way. And I'm telling you, for the first 6-7 years, I wasn't completely sure it was going to fly. But I am very proud of especially the operations, the training, basically everything but the administration was pretty much taken care of. It's just the administrative piece and how we handle the financial piece that still remains. And quite frankly, on the front end, that looked like the smallest piece of the whole puzzle. Right. I realize now it's really a big piece. You know, it's kind of like hitting your thumb with a hammer. It's a small part of your body, but it hurts. And that's all you think about. And that's kind of where we are now. I think the way we administer the organization, besides being inefficient, has become a painful subject. And I think we have a lot of options to look like, or at least a good set of options that what I'm seeing AP Triton is going to do is bring those back to us, and the two councils will be making the decision. But we need to know what the options are, and we need to have a pro and con sheet, which is what they are working on. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. I'm feeling more optimistic about getting this system wrestled down than I've felt for a while. I'm very happy to see how AP Triton was able to bring the two from where we were to where we are now, because there's some years in there that I know I'm missing because I wasn't here. So trying to reconcile that, I think they've shown us as accurately as we're going to get of how we transition. So those are kind of my last pieces, and I really look forward to this next step. Thank you.
You've been kept metaphor a lot.
Yeah, really. Hey, thank you. I think if there are no other comments, I also really want to thank you for this work. It's very thought-provoking, but it's so illuminating. And I think the sort of the specific challenges, I've just found that really interesting to grapple with. So I'm really looking forward to, as you say, the good solutions that you think are emerging out of all of this. I think we're all eager to see that, and appreciate the chief also for all of the work of managing this incredibly complicated organization you're overseeing. So thank you. And I think with that, we are finished with this agenda item. And thank you again very much, Chief. And thank all of you Dan and Don and David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Seamless. Right. Tiny a bit of transition. And I'll also share, while we get to that, share my gratitude for the team and for Chief Caven. And early on, when we were starting the fire chief recruitment process and we were talking about the merger, one of the things I asked him very specifically is, what is it you're looking for? And one of the things that always stuck out is we just want to feel like we're part of a team. And when I've been out in the stations and talking to people and doing ride-alongs, I've heard that pretty consistently, that desire to just feel like we're part of a whole. So I really appreciate the work to get us there. I'm just talking and doing tech stuff all the same time. The workaround for everything. Well, thank you for allowing us the time. I wasn't sure if we were going to get it, and we were prepared not to because we have a tendency of getting pushed to the next thing. We're here tonight to talk to you again about our finance and revenue situation. Tonight, we're actually going to focus a lot more on revenue. We've been talking to you a lot over the last couple of years about some of our financial conditions. Was re-looking at a presentation from last year where I had a design of a rope. If you might remember, there was all the different pieces, and some of those ropes were really focused on revenue. Some of it was focused on economic development. Tonight, we're really going to focus on that. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the process we've been through since we saw you last time, the problems we've been working on, really clarifying for the group, some of the solutions, and then there should be some time for feedback. I think we'll roll through it quickly. So the first thing on the process, since December, when we first came and saw you, we had this giant book of revenue ideas, and we dug pretty deep into the history of how we got here. So part of it has just been that, like, how did we get here? What are the property tax issues that got us here? What are some of our things that got us here? Where have we been since the recession with kind of year-over-year reductions? And really just trying to understand that. So as we're developing solutions, they don't lead us right back to the same spot. We've also been trying to untangle the rope and really simplify what the problems are, because as you know, there's a whole lot of different things that are happening. And what we'd like to be able to do is kind of clarify that into like this problem now, and then this, and then this. And that's work that's in process, but that's been a lot of what we've been working on. And then, as you know, we pulled together a group of folks that have been kind of learning with us, reviewing all of the information that I just showed you, learning about the problems and going through this book. We've called them revenue advisors, but it's a group of community members that includes 2 city councilors, so Councilors Linka and Leach, 2 of our budget committee members, Raina Jackson and Eliza Kaczynski. And then that is supplemented by Dan Bryant, Dana Terrell, Mike Coughlin, Ashley Espinoza, John Borofsky, and one of the mayor's youth advisory council members, Neil Nair. Though I have to disclaim, we met with Neil earlier today. It's one of the learnings of this whole process has been when you really want to be inclusive and bring a youth voice to the table, it's actually pretty challenging when you're also trying to balance people that are working during the day and evenings. It's been a challenge, and he's been great. And I've appreciated that he's been willing to meet with us one-on-one. That group's been going through this book and through all the things, really trying to understand what the problems are and which tools make the most sense for each problem. And so you're going to hear me probably from this point forward and everybody talk about makes sense, feels right. Most initiatives are really successful when they hit both of those marks. So far, we've really been focused on what actually makes sense. Even if you don't like the tool, which problem is it best suited to solve? And then we will move into the what feels right. And that, I think, has more to do with timing and amount. We're not quite there yet. That's what the next section is. So as we've defined the problems, I've really said we have 4 main problems to solve. The first one is our critical funding gap. And Twyla is going to go into a lot more detail about that and about some of the tools that associate. But the critical funding gap, which we are all very familiar of, the revenue plug that we put in this biennium. So this is money we have to find starting in July. At the time, we plugged in $8.3 million. We know that number's higher. We can talk more about that, but that's one of the main problems. The second one are what we call areas at risk. These are the services that are either currently funded with one-time dollars. So we don't have a future for them. And some of that is some of our work around homelessness. Some of it is things we've chosen to fund one time. Again, Twyla's going to get deeper into that. New and or expanded services, as we talked about this before, this is the desire to see more work around housing, more work around climate, potentially new fire station. So those three are three really separate revenue problems, even though they're interconnected. And then for me, what I call the fourth problem, which isn't really necessarily a problem, but as we're thinking about solutions, that the tools and mechanics that we're thinking about are ones that are really sustainable for us in the long term, and that they work together and don't sort of overly impact any one area of our community. And with that, I think Twyla is going to jump into the next pieces, and then they'll come back to me.
Great.
Concord.
Thank you.
You're doing a good job.
Good evening. So as city manager mentioned, our most immediate financial need begins this July. When we brought our adopted budget to you, we knew we had a revenue gap. Sarah mentioned it was $8.3 million when we adopted the budget last summer. This is a result of a structural imbalance in the general fund where revenue growth is much slower than expense growth. Since last summer, we gave you an update in December with a supplemental budget, and our gap continues to grow. This is really related to increased expenditures, expenditure pressures, so higher inflation still lagging a bit high, higher personnel costs, higher PERS advisory rates, and our revenues are generally remaining stagnant. So when we think about that gap growing over the next 2 years, we're looking at an approximate $12 million gap over the next 2 years. We are still in the process of rebuilding our reserves coming out of the pandemic. So budget strategies such as new revenues, possible reductions, and then potential bridge strategies as we look to the future will be necessary as we come into the second year of the biennium, which begins this July. So, and these adjustments are needed to keep funding our ongoing service level. There we go. Okay. So the next area we looked at really are areas at risk. So we've talked about many of these items before. These are those things that are funded, those services that are really funded with limited duration funds or have a funding tail that ends at some point. There's not a sustainable funding source long-term. And so those include unhoused services, which we primarily funded with ARPA funds from the federal government and state funds. Without funding from our partners, current service levels will end at the end of the biennium. So the gap would begin in July of 2025. Also, we've used opioid funds this biennium for our Human Services Commission funding that we provide to the HSC. We do not have funds identified past this biennium in our long-term financial forecast for HSC. So that gap would begin in July of 2025, also at the beginning of the next biennium. We do have a couple of levies. So levies are kind of short-term revenue strategies. So our library levy will expire in June of 2026. So it's currently set at 2.85 million. And so we would, if we were to continue with the levy, we would go either in November of 2025 or May of 2026. And likewise with our park and rec levy currently set at 5.33 million. If we were to extend that service with another levy, we would need to take action by May of 2028 to ensure current service levels moving forward. We also have our community safety payroll tax. This funds a $23.6 million level of community safety services. And under the current ordinance, funding would need to be continued through a vote of the people by November 2028 to continue that service. Otherwise, there could potentially be a gap in community safety funding. In addition to these areas that we've talked about, there were other areas, smaller items that were funded on a one-time basis. in our current biennial budget, such as animal services, that would potentially be at risk if ongoing funding weren't identified. And then the third area is really new and expanded services. So newer services to our portfolio we've talked about before. So affordable housing trust and sustainability efforts have been funded either with limited duration funding or in some cases some ongoing funding, but not necessarily at the level that the community would desire for these services. And additionally, as our community grows over time, service expansions for existing services will continue to grow, such as a new fire station that was talked about previously this evening, to provide adequate service as we look to the future. Now, before we talk a little bit about the work of the Revenue Advisor Group and the tools they've identified, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the numbers you'll see here. So from all of the revenues that were in the report that you received last fall, the group selected 15 revenues to do a deeper dive on as part of that advisory group work. And these are the tools we'll be talking about today. So as part of the revenue report you received last fall, where we had data, we were able to update some of the revenue yields, but there were some more complex revenues such as restaurant tax or personal income tax that we didn't actually update revenues. So when you see some of the numbers here this evening, for those that we weren't able to update at that time, we've used the numbers that were previously identified in past efforts. So they're not currently fresh, but they give you a sense of scale when you're thinking about options. And then of course, actual yields would be dependent on the construction of the tax and administration efforts and other things, but they're provided here to give a sense of scale. The other thing I'll say is this information really is a work in progress. We're continuing to work with the Revenue Advisory Group. So this is based on conversations that we've had with them since December. We asked the group to consider each of the 15 options to consider a range of criteria, including how much revenue would be generated, the impact on taxpayer, what the administration efforts and collection efforts would be, and also the impact on community, among other things. While each revenue option has different impacts and considerations, generally the group felt that the options that were shown here for solutions for these different funding issues made sense for the problem being solved and could be considered by the city manager as she works to develop a solution as we come into the next year. Some made more sense than others, and while they were still viable, there were concerns noted in the conversation, and I'll talk about a few of those things today. When considering the long-term strategy, revenue options flagged here were sustainable over the long term and would grow over time rather than being flat or decline in time. So when you see check boxes under the long-term strategy, that's generally what that's indicating. Additionally, discussion about economic development and a healthy business climate for the community was part of the conversation along the way and is an area of interest for several members of the group. So we'll start here by looking at the tools. Again, these of all of the 15 options, these were the best. These tools made the best sense to solve the funding issue here. So I'll try to go through these quickly so that you have some time to discuss these. So service fees are used broadly across the state to recover all or a portion of service provided. These fees are billed to occupants of a developed property. The group felt that this option makes sense if tied to specific services currently provided by the city and not based as a broad or general fee, and that this source would be sustainable over time. A business license fee also had general support, particularly if the revenues were used to support economic development and a healthy business climate and support the business community. And then the local option levy, which is a 5-year measure for operating expenses, was identified here as a possible bridge strategy in the event that more time was needed to develop a long-term strategy. So it could be a bridge in the short term, even though it isn't sustainable over the long term. The franchise fee made sense here to the group, but it had a stronger nexus for much of the group to new services, particularly as it relates to climate work. And finally, while increasing the frozen base option was considered viable, we are already implementing this as part of the current budget, And this additional $400,000 would be an expansion to that measure. And it was noted by the group that it could potentially create timing implications to projects in the urban renewal district. And for that reason, this option had some concern raised, although it was still considered viable. Okay, next we'll move along to tools for areas at risk. So these were the options that made the most sense for this funding issue. So the first is a PILT, or a payment in lieu of tax. This is a tax, it's a payment made by a tax exempt entity such as a government or nonprofit to compensate for some of the costs of providing municipal services to these entities as they don't pay property taxes. The group was interested in this concept generally, but they recognized that agreements would need to be reached with some entities such as the University of Oregon to enact this option. And they felt that it should only be pursued on a larger scale across all nonprofits if such an agreement were reached. There was quite a bit of interest actually in a personal income tax, specifically on high wage earners. While this could be used for any purpose, there was an interest from some of the members to use this for unhoused services, and that resonated with quite a bit of the group. It was noted that we could use a local option levy to provide services as needed for parks and libraries until a more permanent solution was found. And then also a first responder fee, which is a fee to recoup costs related to providing services to emergency responses. While this was identified here as a possible tool for this area, it could also be a tool for the critical funding gap, or also for expanded fire services. And then the restaurant tax was identified here as a potential alternative to a community safety payroll tax. If funding isn't renewed in the future. General concerns with a restaurant tax were the impact on restaurants and the current economic environment, and then also to the low-income population in the community, as this is a challenging time. But they felt that it could potentially be used in that event if the CSPT not moving forward. Okay, and we're to the last area, which is tools for new and expanded services. I'll try to touch on the ones I haven't touched upon already. So affordable housing bond in 2018, the Oregon Constitution was amended to allow local governments to issue GEO bonds to finance the cost of constructing affordable housing, including when funds go to a non-governmental entity. This was of interest to the group as a potential tool for affordable housing. Climate impact fees are a one-time fee charged to mitigate the impact of emissions created through development-related activities. And these fees have been used to help communities invest in projects that lower our community's greenhouse gas emissions and could potentially be used for sustainability efforts. However, it was noted that the source generally declines over time as the community's building stock converts to renewable energy, so it wasn't considered sustainable over the long term. And we've touched briefly on the other ones, similar comments. There, construction excise tax. This would raise the construction excise tax from 0.5% to 1%, with revenues going towards affordable housing. An admissions tax, which is, of course, a tax on admissions to events. The yield shown here is the estimate based on the City of Eugene facilities. A broader tax would have a greater yield. Given that many communities have admissions taxes, there was interest from the group as a possible revenue source for the city, as this could make sense for this issue and perhaps others, so it could perhaps be used for some of the other funding issues. The similar concerns related to the restaurant tax and frozen base were talked about here. And then finally, with the solid waste collection fee, while this is a viable source, there was some concern that there might be other increases to solid waste fees over the next few years, and that this could disproportionately impact another fee or another rate increase could disproportionately impact low-income community members. So I will just say before I hand things over to Sarah, this was a great group. They had really robust conversations and asked a lot of wonderful questions. And I'll turn things over to Sarah.
And the problem for them now is that I never, ever want that to end because the conversations have been so useful. I'll move quickly through this, but I think part of the thing I've been thinking a lot about is we have been looking back at our history, but I'm also spending a lot of time thinking about what are we setting us up for in the future. I think it's really important that whatever we're doing here actually allows us to continue to serve going forward. There's a lot of ways that we can generate revenue. Economic development is a tool that we want to continue to explore, and I'm glad that that is continuing to surface. There's definitely a lot of concern in the group about the services. There's also a real call to make sure that we're also still being efficient and being thoughtful about the services we provide, and a clear kind of immediate look at the near term. I think most of us, including the advisors, are very concerned about the critical kind of right in front of us gap. It's important to mention, we won't go into it in detail today, but at the same time, the other piece of the strategy is what happens if we don't. And we're continuing to do program analysis. The exec team is deep in that, and they have been for weeks, trying to determine, okay, if we have to make those cuts, where are we going to make them? So more on that and some bridge strategies. Some of these dates may move. You don't have a lot of time here to talk today, but we can actually come back on the 11th and just keep going with this. So this is, we can do a lighter touch at the beginning of that meeting and continue on. And then we'll be back pretty much right after your break to talk about what a potential strategy is to kind of hit all of these marks going forward. Thank you. I think we can.
Okay. Thank you. I just have to say that I appreciate that summary. I've been sitting in on those revenue meetings, and the conversation has been so probing and thoughtful, and really, it's really been inspiring, the group that you've gathered. So I also have high hopes for how they'll sort of sort this out as you get to the final stages of that conversation. Are there questions or comments from council on this? Reactions?
Deep breathing.
Oh, Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you for this. This is, I was excited to chew on the findings, and hear from our liaisons who served on the committee. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Alan, for stepping up. There's some ideas I had thrown out early on that didn't percolate, didn't rise to the top of the crop. And I'd love to hear maybe why, or if there's an opportunity to park. Was there a parking lot in this committee to explore revenue options down the road? How do we keep this committee alive? Because things evolve, and I don't suspect that we're going to embrace anywhere near all of the suggestions, but I really appreciate the wide breadth of suggestions that are potentially on the table. Admissions tax, for example. There's a lot of enthusiasm around that piece in circles I run in, but also a lot of concern that it would not hurt small businesses that have patrons of, let's say, less than 100 persons, for like a small concert or a movie theater at like the Art House or the Broadway Metro. It wouldn't really make sense to have that kind of admissions fee, I would think, for those small businesses, but it would make sense for like a concert at the McDonald's or a basketball game at Mac Court. Was there conversations around Airbnb and short-term rentals? Were there conversations around rental vehicles? I recently went to Southern California and visited my grandma who turned 97. Rented a car online because whatever it was, budget, said $29 a day. I jumped on it. When I went to pick up the vehicle, there was an additional $71 in taxes. So the county of Los Angeles squeezed me. But what are we doing to perhaps glean some revenue from the crowd that will be renting vehicles in our city streets? And then finally, the communities of Boulder, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, Albany, New York, have all initiated some semblance of a soda tax that can generate anywhere from $1 million to $75 million. $1 million in the low end if you're a Berkeley, $25 million if you're a Philadelphia. What was the conversation, if any, about a high fructose corn syrup, sugary beverage tax.
We'll have to tag team this. So some of these, so I would say there was a good, robust conversation about some of these items that I would say are still on the table, and they kind of got lumped in. So for example, the admissions tax sort of fell under the category that I would call the payment in lieu of tax. It was kind of a bigger conversation about, are there different ways to generate it? So I wouldn't say it's off the table because there was quite a bit of conversation. It just didn't hit the very top. And I would point to Counselor Zelenka Leach to fill that in. All of these got some touch. They just weren't the top. Didn't make the most sense, but it doesn't mean they're completely off the table. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah. As for this group too, there were many, I think we had 100 or so options. And so it was really when we went through understanding what our problems were, the three categories for that group, those 15 were the ones that resonated the most and they wanted more information on. It's not that they didn't talk about the other options and there weren't other options in here that potentially could be viable. I would say for that group, those were the ones that rose to the top that they really wanted to discuss on it as a part of a deeper dive.
Again, though, a work in progress, and part of what we are hoping to get today is more feedback because we can continue to run these ideas with the group.
Can I add to that?
Well,
To
you can have a turn, but it's Mike and then it'll be you. Go for it, Mike.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I appreciate the presentation. I'm like my colleague, Matt, there was some stuff that I had hoped to see bubble to the top that didn't. One of the things for me, and I'm never actually sure how to frame the question and have this as a part of the conversation. So I'll do my best. We pay for local government predominantly with property taxes. That's where the grand majority of the money comes from property taxes. Now, the people of the state of Oregon have said, we're not going to let you increase the rate that you tax on land they've decided to limit that rate. But what they haven't ever limited is the amount of land. And so it's always a question to me why we don't have that conversation, because this community has never added land to the city, ever. Not in the last, the city limits of this land, the amount of property taxable land isn't something, as a matter of fact, we've kind of decided we're not going to. Now we're going to add people. We continually add people. And it seems like we're spending more and more money per person that lives here. But we don't tax people, we tax land. And I wonder why it is we don't analyze for that particular factor of how it would, what it would take for us to increase revenues by, what in increasing land volume or taxable value would be worth considering. Is that something that you had any conversations with about at the level you guys were talking about?
So
committee level.
So we had a deep dive into property taxes as far as annexation and things of that nature, adding more. And that wasn't an area necessarily of focus for this group. I think there was, although we had some information in the report around that topic, I think they were focusing on some of these levers. There was also conversation about longer term pieces that I think when I think about property tax reform, some of the annexation and growth pieces, economic development. So those were threads through the conversation. But for the near term, when we looked at the near term gap and kind of the focus for this group for this first round, they weren't topics that we did a deep dive in.
Topics that you what, sorry?
did a deep dive in. So they weren't chosen to move forward for this near term
Because
conversation.
there wasn't enough value in it? I didn't hear the big.
I don't think it's a value no, I wouldn't say it's a value conversation. I think when they were thinking about the near-term gap and the critical funding issue we have that starts in July and then some of these other issues, they focused on some of the other tools and levers in this report. And I think those things I mentioned, such as property taxes, annexation, greater economic development, were considered, my interpretation would be, they would be considered more of a longer term strategy. And so they weren't focused on as part of this original conversation.
Because it wouldn't happen fast enough. Right.
Yes.
I would love to see, although I don't know if you've done this kind of calculation, how much over time that, and I don't know how far back in the past it would be useful to look, but as our population has grown and our budget has grown over time, it would be interesting to me to see how much we spend per average person or group of persons in our city. In other words, how much we're spending on a per resident basis over time, whether we're spending more for the number of, people who live here or less, would be an interesting statistic to get sometime.
All right, Mike, you're in the red.
So that was my best Alan imitation.
Okay, and Alan, you're up.
3 points. One, to your point, Mike, the conversation is really about near-term revenue. So what can we get in 1 to 2 years? And things like adding land and doing economic development are great long-term strategies, as staff said, but I think it's something like you need to add 3 Valley River Centers worth of investment in the city to get $1 million. And we have $8 to $10 million hole. So a great strategy to focus on for jobs and other things, but not fill the short-term revenue strategy as a short-term revenue strategy. So, and then the other part of that conversation that we had was the administrative effort versus to revenue ratio. So some of the things you were talking about, Matt, are great ideas, but they take so much effort, they get so little money. They don't help us solve the problem because the problem's so big. And so need to net millions of dollars. So the ones that got focused on, the ones that moved to the higher priorities for next kind of round of stuff were the ones that could net a significant amount of money that could help solve the revenue problem. And then finally, I would say that one of the other things that we had numerous conversations about was the University of Oregon and how they play into all this. And we really haven't had conversations with them about any of this. So all that kind of conversation about what they can do, whether or not we can help tax football games or basketball games or other kinds of things using their facilities is a conversation that probably needs to occur, but it wasn't really ripe for again, because of the timing, because of the revenue need that we have as in the real short term.
Okay, thank you. We're at 7, but I have 2 folks wanting a second round. So how about a lightning round? You each have a minute. So Matt and then Mike.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, super lightning round. Of the 60,000 people that would attend like a game at Autzen, I would wonder what percentage of them are coming from outside of our area. And I would estimate back of the napkin math, it's probably half.
At least.
Yeah. So, but I look forward to those conversations with the university. I appreciate that the body looked at both short term and long term. I maybe baseball's on my mind because it's spring training and other reasons, but I see an opportunity where you could swing for the fence, or you can get them on and get them over and get them in. And it seems to me like there's a lot of in between. There's some big ticket items that are home runs. And then those base hits weren't as celebrated, but that blend is how you win the day. And so I'm just one of 8, but I would ask future bodies to look at not just the long-term and short-term gains, but what are the base hits that could really do some great work for our community in comparison to those potential home runs?
Okay, Mike.
I really, really hope that the manager is looking at this in terms of long-term. I know that it's a short-term issue you're trying to fix for right now. But we have this as a reoccurring issue over time. And it doesn't seem like projections show us getting out of it at some magical point in the future. So I hope we're managing this for long-term revenue growth rather than short-term. And lastly, I'd love to have a tool that we don't have. How can we tell whether our expenditures as a city organization are sustainable or unsustainable? The growth of our expenditures, because we've grown in the amount we're spending in the last several years. And I want to ask the question, are we growing at a sustainable level? How do we know? And how do we not know? And I'd love to have more feedback on where's that tool? How to know that? Thank you.
That question, your kind of line of questions are things we've also been hearing from this group. Just an equal concern about expenditures, growth, how do we compare? And I should have noted early on, I think there's only one city in Oregon who's not facing exactly what we're facing right now and having very similar conversations. So we're all sort of looking at each other, and I think that's useful. Sure.
Okay, and this is a stay tuned situation because you'll be back talking about this again. So thank you all. We are adjourned until our next meeting.